Does the United States have a so-called smoking gun on Iran? The US ambassador to the UN displays what she calls undeniable evidence of Iran supplying fighters in Yemen with missiles to fire at Saudi Arabia. Iran says it's unfounded and provocative propaganda. So who's right? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Laura Kyle. For the first time, the United States has publicly showcased what it says is undeniable evidence of Iran's military involvement in Yemen's conflict with Saudi Arabia. At a military base in Washington, US Ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, displayed what she says are parts of an Iranian-made ballistic missile. Haley says the material points to Iran's violation of an international agreement on arms. Well, Iran says the allegations are unfounded, irresponsible and provocative. The Iranian foreign minister tweeted to compare Haley's presentation with the former US Secretary of State, Colin Powell. He made his infamous speech on Iraq's alleged weapons of mass destruction to the UN Security Council in 2003. His statements later turned out to be false. We'll get to our guests in just a moment, but first, here's our State Department correspondent, Rosalind Jordan.
The U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, traveled from an institution devoted to diplomacy to a military base on Thursday to point the finger at Iran. The Trump administration is accusing Tehran of illegally supplying weapons to groups across the Middle East, explosive boats, drones, and Qaem short-range ballistic missiles. Haley told reporters she was standing in front of one of those alleged missiles.
These are the recovered pieces of a missile fired by Houthi militants from Yemen into Saudi Arabia. The missile's intended target was the civilian airport in Riyadh.
The November 4th attack on the Riyadh airport is one of the many clashes between the Saudi-backed government and Houthi rebels trying to conquer the country. And the attack is mentioned in the UN Secretary General's latest report on Iran's compliance with the nuclear deal. But officials say that mention is not a confirmation.
There's no conclusive evidence about the provenance of those missiles, but you can read the report for yourself.
Even before the press conference was over, the Iranians rejected Haley's charges. These accusations seek also to cover up for the Saudi war crimes in Yemen with the U.S. complicity and divert international and regional attention from the stalemate war of aggression against the Yemenis that has so far killed more than 10,000 civilians, displaced 3 million, crippled Yemen's infrastructure and health system, and pushed the country to the brink of largest famine the world has seen for decades, as the UN has warned. The Swedish ambassador to the UN told reporters he is concerned the U.S. is trying to find new reasons to scrap the Iran nuclear deal.
As far as I'm informed, that agreement is being implemented by Iran on the nuclear issue. Now, we would be very happy to discuss with America and others, the broader role of Iran in the region.
Analysts say while checking Iran's behavior is important, the Trump administration is taking a risk.
I would hope that there will be more evidence put forward, both in general and for that matter, for Ambassador Haley's sake. Obviously, it's important if she's making such claims to have evidence for them.
Haley made it clear the U.S. is doing what needs to be done for the sake of national security.
You will see us build a coalition to really push back against Iran and what they're doing.
A warning to Tehran, at least for now. Rosalind Jordan, Al Jazeera, Washington.
OK, then let's bring in our panel. From Tehran, Foad Izadi, Professor of World Studies at the University of Tehran, who specialises in US-Iran relations. Via Skype from Geneva, Jean-Marc Rickli, Head of Global Risk at the Geneva Centre for Security Policy. And from Washington, D.C., Vaez, Senior Iran Analyst at the International Crisis Group. Welcome, all of you gentlemen. Foad, if I can start with you. The US says this is concrete evidence that it now has, that Iran is supplying weapons to Houthi fighters in Yemen. What's the response there in Iran?
I don't think even American officials, when they speak in private, would buy those accusations. Today we have a New York Times story with the title, U.S. Accuses Iran of UN violations, but evidence falls short. And they quote a number of Defense Department officials stating the fact that just accusing Iran for giving ballistic missiles to the Yemenis is not really an accurate accusation.
Okay.
You know, Yemen is totally blockaded by the Saudis. They are not able to, people are not able to go in and out. You cannot even send a bag of rice to Yemen, let alone missiles or ballistic missiles. And the size of the missile that you saw in the pictures with Ms. Haley is quite large. So it is not the case that Iran has done that. Yemen has an army. The army has been defending the country. Yemen is a sovereign country, and the Yemenis army had missiles of different types before the war, including ballistic missiles. And it is no surprise for the Yemenis army to use these missiles against the aggression that they're facing from their neighbor, from the Saudis.
Let's pass the mic over to Jean-Marc. Do you agree with Foad? Does the evidence here fall short? Tell us about the weapons that we see behind Nikki Haley there in that military base.
Right, so there are two aspects here that we have to talk about. There is a forensic part, which, as was rightly said before, there are some shortcomings here. We're talking about a variant of a Scud-C missiles that the Iranian call Qiyam-1 and the Houthis call Burgan-2. And here the question is whether this weapon originates from Iran or not. It could also originate from North Korea, because North Korea also had that kind of missiles. What Nikki Haley did not say and report was when, if that was the case, the Iranian would have transferred these missiles to the Houthis. And also, they were talking about a drone, a Kasif-1 drone. They did not mention when and where it was recovered. So these pieces, which are key in a forensic investigation, are missing. Now you have to look at the broader picture. And the broader picture in the Middle East is that you have two camps these days facing each others. And Iran has been successful to develop a specific way of warfare using surrogate warfare, as we have seen, for instance, in Syria with Hezbollah and different Shia militias. And therefore, from the Saudi perspective, now that ISIS has been almost defeated physically in Syria and Iraq, it looks like Iran has emerged. And so Saudi Arabia feel encircled by the Iranians. So the context is very important. And unfortunately, the context in the Gulf region is currently towards an arms race and increasing confrontations.
Ali, does that then explain why Nikki Haley came out with this now? I mean, she said that it's very rare. She said herself it's very rare to declassify this type of military equipment. So that does beg the question, why do it?
Let me first say that I absolutely agree with my two colleagues about the fact that the evidence really fell short in the sense that we really didn't learn from this presentation when these weapons were transferred to the Houthis, how they were transferred, which is a really important question, and then when they were used. But look, I think this had nothing to do with Yemen per se. This was more geared towards the domestic political scene in the United States. We know that Ambassador Haley has political ambitions, and there are a lot of rumors about the next Secretary of State in the U.S. because Mr. Tillerson seems to have one foot out of the door. And also towards the next milestone in the nuclear deal, which is mid-January, when the president has to decide once again whether he wants to certify or decertify Iran's compliance under the nuclear deal. And this time, he also has to decide whether he wants to extend sanctions relief or not. Mrs. Haley had a similar speech at AEI a few months ago that paved the ground for President Trump to decertify Iran's compliance under the nuclear deal. Now, this one could have two different purposes. Maybe this time the president wants to withdraw from the nuclear deal, especially because Congress has failed to deliver on what the president asked it to do, which was to modify and fix the nuclear deal. Or maybe this time around, they want to actually extend sanctions relief and stay in the deal, but they need to counterbalance that by sounding and looking tough on Iran.
Right, because of course Nikki Haley did say that this has nothing to do with the Iran nuclear deal.
Yes, she said that, but in practice, there is a linkage between the nuclear issue and the regional issue. And in another part of her presentation, she said that the nuclear deal has nothing to improve Iranian behavior in the region. And I think for the administration, there is no serious pushback against Iran as long as the nuclear deal is in place. I really feel that the administration sees the nuclear deal as an obstacle in its way to getting really tough with Iran. So we have to see. It's hard to predict whether President Trump would actually use this as justification to withdraw from the deal, or he will still stay in the deal and try to at least sound more tough on Iran. Because in practice, in concrete steps, we haven't heard anything new. Ambassador Haley mentioned that she would go to the UN Security Council. I think with this kind of evidence, it's almost crystal clear that the Russians and the Chinese will not support any U.S. resolution against Iran at the Security Council.
So far, does Iran feel quite safe at the moment? Does it feel that it's got most of the international opinion on side?
Yes, I think that's a correct statement. Also, the Saudis are suffering in terms of international public opinion because of the atrocities that they're committing. More than 10,000 people have been killed in Yemen in the last couple of years. Lots of people are sick. They don't have access to food. Millions of people. Yemen has about 28 million population. Most of them don't have access to food and clean water, enough food and clean water. We have a cholera epidemic that is widespreading, and children are dying because of simple diseases, because of lack of medicine. And the Saudis have blockaded all ports that can provide access to these essential humanitarian needs.
Can I just jump in there, though, because there still is the question that isn't quite fully answered by anyone, but certainly the possibility isn't ruled out either, that Iran is supplying weapons to Houthi rebels.
Iran is not. But imagine if, let's, for the sake of argument, let's say Iran is supplying. Of course, that's a very difficult thing to say because unlike Syria, unlike Lebanon, Iran does not have a land corridor from its borders to Yemen. The only way Iran can get to Yemen is through sea. And when you blockade all ports, it's really not possible for anything to reach, and Iran is not able to do that.
Jean-Marc, that's quite a fair point, isn't it? That Yemen is blockaded. How on earth do you move a missile of that size? It was enormous. How do you get that undetected into the country and to rebels?
Right, obviously, when you smuggle such weapons, you do not smuggle the entire weapon as such. You can smuggle it in different parts. There is obviously the maritime blockade, but there are still ways to get to Yemen underground through Oman, for instance, and the border between Oman and Yemen is quite porous. It's well known. So there are always ways to smuggle materials. But I just wanted to return to what was said earlier. Nikki Haley made a connection through a resolution 2031 in her speech, and this resolution basically formalized the nuclear agreement between the P5+1 and Iran. And here what we're witnessing is, if you want, the problems of diplomatic language, because in this resolution, Iran is not banned from developing missiles, but developing technology that could be used to carry nuclear warheads. And the wording of the resolution is also not very clear, because it is calling upon and not banning as such. So inherently in the structure of the resolution, if you want, you could say that Iran is allowed to smuggle or is not, and so that makes any case very very difficult. That's why you need to understand the context, and currently the context is really towards an increase in arms race, as well as confrontation through surrogates and proxies, and so both sides are to blame, and there is no one side that could say that they have been attacked. I mean, it's a combination of different factors that makes the situation right now in the Middle East, I would say in the Gulf especially, very explosive.
But Ali, is there not also another UN resolution? Correct me if I'm wrong there, but I believe there is another UN resolution that bans Iran from delivering weapons to Houthi leaders.
Well, there is a resolution on Yemen that bans any transfer of weapons to Houthi rebels. And I think the part of Resolution 2231 on Iran that Ambassador Haley was referring to is that there is still also an arm embargo imposed on Iran's ability to transfer any kind of weapons outside of the country to anyone until 2020. That's the part of violation of Resolution 2231 that she was referring to. But if you look at the language of the Secretary General, because Resolution 2231 does not have a sanctions committee, does not have a panel of experts, it is very hard for the UN to be able to verify these claims. So usually the Secretary General refers to claims by certain countries that would come up with some kind of evidence, but would then say the UN is looking into this and is still investigating. And the UN report is absolutely not conclusive on this issue. And another part of forensic questions that I would actually put on the table is that remember that the official narrative in Saudi Arabia and the US is that this missile that was fired at Riyadh airport was intercepted by Patriot missiles. But there was no evidence of this on the body of the missile that Mrs. Haley demonstrated.
Foad, just to move the discussion on a little bit, the Iranian foreign minister tweeted this picture that we saw earlier of Nikki Haley alongside a picture of Colin Powell back in 2003. Is there a feeling there in Iran that we're sensing a similar build-up to what we saw before the Iraq invasion?
I think this is a feeling that not only you have in Tehran, you have all over the world. We have an aggressive Republican president that has no limitations in terms of playing with evidence or intelligence. He is set to cause difficulties for Iran. And if the international community does not stop him, you will have another Iraq war in your hand. The only difference is that Iran is not Iraq. Iran is able to defend itself, and it's going to be a very difficult war. So the best thing for everybody that's watching this program or is interested in these matters is to basically put pressure on the United States. They have been supporting the Saudi war criminals in Yemen for the last many years, selling them over $80 billion of weapons in the last few years. And they are very much part of the Yemen war. The spokeswoman for the U.S. National Security Council, on the first day that the Saudis started bombing Yemen, had a news conference saying that they support the attack, and they said that they are helping the Saudis with logistics and intelligence.
Right.
So you provide the Saudis with weapons, and then you tell the Saudis where to drop those weapons. And this is war crime. I think I encourage you to read the UN humanitarian representative for Yemen, Johannes van der. And you know, the statements that he has been making is not getting enough media attention.
Okay, absolutely, but let's not forget as well that the Houthis
the fact that the Saudis
potentially
are
been
causing
accused of war crimes as well. There are atrocities being committed on both sides in Yemen. It's very important, as you say, to bring both of those sides to light.
That is blaming the victims. That is blaming the victims.
Okay.
The Saudis are killing innocent women and children on a daily basis, and not supporting the aggressors, I think, would be a good idea.
Ali, it's very difficult from where I'm sitting to see where the US's endgame is or what it is. I mean, Nikki Haley talks about building a coalition to move against Iran. First of all, to do what? And also, who would be part of that coalition?
Look, there seems to be a coalition between Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the United States aimed at cutting Iran down to size. I fear that the risk in this particular situation is that Houthis are not Iranian proxies. They are supported by Iran. I think there is little doubt about that. But the fact that they're fiercely independent in this situation is quite dangerous because they might take actions on their own without necessarily any guidance from Iran that would actually have direct consequences for Iran and for its relations with the U.S. and for the fate of the nuclear deal. Remember that when the Houthis went to Sana'a, the Iranian advice to them was actually not to do so, but they nevertheless did not listen to the Iranian advice. The Iranians then told them not to go to Aden. They did so nevertheless. And then again, in this case, I fear that if the Houthis decide to use the technology that they already have, their missiles are more accurate and have longer ranges than before, whether that's with Iranian help or not, that's a reality on the ground. And if this time they use their missiles to attack a Saudi or an Emirati city that results in casualties, I feel with this setup that we currently have, with this atmosphere, with so much tension and friction between Iran and the United States and the fate of nuclear deal hanging in the balance, that there might be a sense in Washington that President Trump should do something about it. And the risk is that he might decide to retaliate not against the Houthis in Yemen, but directly on Iranian soil, which is a very dangerous provocation. But there is I sense this motivation that without bloodying Iran's nose, the administration is really not able to satisfy its allies in the region or to push back against Iran. And the consequences of such action, of course, will be devastating for the entire region. It would deepen all of these tensions that we're seeing from Iraq to Syria to Lebanon to Yemen.
Absolutely.
And could result in Iranian asymmetric retaliation that would be quite dangerous.
Jean-Marc, what's Europe's reaction to all this? Would they get on side with Trump doing something about it, as Ali says?
Well, I think it's a fair assessment, especially after the assassination of Saleh. The situation in Yemen is even more explosive and very fluid, because with Saleh you had a point of entry in the country, and when Saleh was ready to negotiate, he was assassinated. Now, basically, you have the Houthis, but you have also lots of different former Saleh's supporters that you have to unite. And sometimes in proxy or surrogate warfare, the problem is controlling your surrogate. And as was mentioned previously, you just need a small event that could actually spark a major confrontation in the Gulf and the broader Middle East, because, as I mentioned earlier, the current situation is very tense, especially since the fall of the Islamic States and the perception in Riyadh that they are being encircled now by Iran and surrogates or proxies of Iran from Lebanon up until Yemen.
Okay, well, let's hope that small event doesn't happen. Many thanks to all our guests for joining us here today. Foad, Izadi, Jean-Marc Rickli and Ali Vaez. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, that's aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page, that's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Laura Kyle, and the whole team here, bye for now.